now been a week since the day of resurrection, Easter Sunday. And although in church our celebration of Easter is 50 days long, all the way from Easter Sunday until Pentecost, the numbers that were here last week have thinned a little bit. The Easter lilies on the altar, though still beautiful, are looking a little more weathered. And our Easter joy this week is perhaps just a little more muted than last Sunday. As Christians, people striving to follow Jesus Christ, one of our core convictions is that the resurrection changes everything. We believe that because of what happened to Jesus, because of the cross and the empty tomb, that the world is now somehow different, that somehow there is, even in death, the possibility for life. The thing is, though, you have to stick around for longer than just Easter Sunday to really experience this new life. Because it's only after Easter Sunday, only after the dust from the resurrection begins to settle, that we begin to realize what this new resurrection life is going to look like. And guess what? There are going to be some surprises. Because it turns out that life after the resurrection, it isn't business as usual. During Easter, you can say goodbye to the status quo. As Mary Magdalene discovered in the Easter Gospel last Sunday in John's Gospel, when she tried to cling to the risen Jesus and was told by him, "No, you have to let me go." Things are different now. We get a powerful glimpse of that new reality in this morning's Gospel story, also from John's Gospel. This is a story about the status quo being shattered, if ever there were one. It begins, after all, with the risen Jesus mysteriously passing through closed and locked doors and appearing to the disciples. And not just once, but twice. But this isn't even the biggest surprise, at least not for me. There's another one coming. And here is what it is. The risen Jesus, who comes to the disciples and appears to them, still bears his wounds. He still bears them, the wounds he received on the cross from the nails driven into his hands and feet and from the spear that punctured his side. Here Jesus has been raised from the dead. Here he's gone from being a corpse to a living body, yet he still has these wounds. Now, I don't know about you, but I would have thought that the resurrection would mean no more wounds, that it would mean a fresh slate, a brand new body, no more reminders of the humiliation and suffering and defeat of Good Friday. I'd have thought the resurrection would mean that all that is now behind Jesus, and yet here they are, those wounds. Even the risen Jesus carries the marks of the cross on his body. And not only does he still carry these wounds on his body, but the very first thing he does, both times when he appears to the disciples in our gospel story, is to show his wounds to them. In fact, it's the wounds that convince the disciples that it really is Jesus, that he's real, that he's not just some ghost or hallucination, that he has a real body and that he has really, really been raised to new life. And of course, for Thomas, who initially doubts that Jesus has appeared to the other disciples, it's the wounds of Jesus that end up giving him the gift of his faith. It's in seeing Jesus' wounds, in touching the wounds, that he comes to believe in Jesus. My Lord and my God, he says. This story about Jesus' wounds has gotten me thinking about wounds this past week. Physical wounds, emotional wounds, spiritual wounds, other kinds of wounds, my own wounds, and the wounds that I know many of you carry because you have told me about them. We all have them, don't we? Those wounds. In one way or another, the wounds we've gotten from life. I was also thinking this week about how so often we are afraid to show our wounds, how we're afraid to bare our wounds to one another. I mean, it's relatively easy to show the parts of ourselves where everything is okay, right? Where everything is shiny and squeaky clean. But our wounds, I think they're a lot harder to show, at least from my own experience. Showing our wounds can feel a lot riskier, a lot more vulnerable. And so sometimes, maybe more often than not, we keep them hidden. We pretend that we're okay. We pretend that we're fine. And when people ask, we just smile and say, we're good, we're okay, we're fine. It is hard to show our wounds, including sometimes even in church. In fact, from my experience in churches over many years, sometimes especially in church. Sometimes churches can make people feel like they can't really bear their wounds, or like they can't really bring all of themselves to church. Like they have to hide their wounds so they'll be presentable to God or dress up for God. As if church is a social club where everyone has to appear happy and well-adjusted at all times. I'll never forget one time in my last church before I came to St. Peter's when I got an email from a parishioner who frequently served as a Eucharistic minister at the altar on Sundays. In the email, she apologized to me for the way she had acted at the altar the previous Sunday. She said it had been the day after the anniversary of her husband's unexpected death a few years before, leaving her and her infant daughter all alone. And during the offertory hymn, which was Amazing Grace, she lost it. I looked over and tears were streaming down her face. And in her email, she said that she was really sorry that she had let that happen in church. That made me feel so sad that anyone felt like they needed to apologize for tears in church. I wrote her back, and I don't really remember exactly what I said to her, but I do remember thinking to myself, gosh, if we can't shed tears in this church, if we can't shed tears around this altar, if we can't show one another our wounds in this community, then what is the point? Why are we even here? We might as well pack up and call it a day. Which brings me back to our gospel story this morning. During this Easter season at church, one of the things that we remember about ourselves at church is that we are now Christ's risen body. Again and again, throughout these 50 days of Easter, we are continually reminded, as Teresa of Avila once prayed, that Christ has no body but ours, no hands and no feet on earth, but ours, that ours are the hands with which he looks, with which he feels compassion on the world. Ours are the feet with which he walks to do good. Ours are the eyes with which he blesses the world in love. And one of the amazing things about Christ's risen body, our gospel story reminds us today, is that the wounds are still there. They haven't just disappeared, and Jesus doesn't try to hide them either. And nor should we. Christ's risen body in the world today. Being Christ's body doesn't mean that we're not supposed to have wounds anymore, or that we have to brush our wounds under the carpet, or pretend like we're perfect, or like everything's fine, when it isn't. No, being Christ's body in the world, his risen body, means that it's okay to have wounds, and it's okay to show our wounds to one another. In fact, it's more than okay. It's part of how we show one another that we are real. It's part of how we authentically share Jesus with one another. Chances are, when people come through those doors of our building, they are not looking for a church full of perfect people, or another place where they feel like they have to pretend to be something or somebody they're not. Chances are they're looking for a community of real people, a place where they can be themselves, wounds and all, a place where they can be real. And here's the thing, part of what makes us real, as Thomas and the other disciples discovered, part of what makes us real is our wounds. And part of what makes us Jesus' risen body in the world is our willingness to bear those wounds. And hopefully, part of what makes us the church is that we can be a place where others can bear their wounds too. And so, as we continue our Easter celebration over these coming 50 days, may we become more and more and more that kind of community and that kind of church. Amen.